streaks on her cheeks as she looked up at him. Her long, thick, honey-blonde hair was disarrayed from the tossing around she had been doing in her sleep.
"Oh, Cory,"
she said in a wretched voice.
"He came back again."
"No, he didn't," Cory said firmly as he knelt beside her and slipped an arm around her shoulders. "It was just a dream, Lucille. That renegade wasn't here. He can't hurt you." She turned her head and buried her face against his shoulder.
"Why won't he leave me alone?"
she sobbed.
"Doesn't he understand that I had to kill him?"
He just held her and made soft, soothing noises. There was nothing he could say. Lucille had killed one of the renegades when they attacked the wagon train a couple of days earlier. She had probably saved her own life and Cory's life in the process. But she had come to terms with the fact that she had pulled the trigger of the Kerr revolver and put a bullet in the middle of a man's chest. Lucille had witnessed more than her share of violence in her life, but never before had she killed a man. The renegade had richly deserved killing, thought Cory. The gang would have slaughtered everyone on the wagon train in order to get their hands on the supplies it was carrying. Flour, sugar, guns, and ammunition. Those things were more precious than gold and gems right now, in October 1862. And the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, where the supplies were headed, was a prize most coveted by the hated Yankees. Ever since New Orleans had fallen to the Federals earlier in the year, the Yankees had set their sights on Vicksburg. Already Union forces were in control of the upper and lower ends of the mighty Mississippi River, and if the Northerners could take Vicksburg, they would close an iron fist around the entirety of the river. They would split the Confederacy in half, cutting off the flow of supplies from the west, and more important, it would open the river to northern commerce. Midwestern farmers accustomed to shipping their crops down the river to New Orleans and on to the rest of the world from there had lost their market when the Confederate batteries at Vicksburg closed the Mississippi. The war was already quite unpopular in some sections of the North, and it would only become more so as long as it interfered with commerce. The political pressure on Abraham Lincoln to reach a peaceful settlement with the Confederacy would only intensify. So, Vicksburg had to fall for the Yankee invasion to succeed. Cory and those with him on this wagon train were equally determined that it would not. The supply line from Texas had been the idea of Colonel Thompson of the Mississippi Home Guard. He was also Lucille's uncle. During the early days of the war, the Vicksburg, Shreveport, and Texas Railroad had been completed as far as Monroe, and from that Louisiana town to Marshall, the largest city in eastern Texas, was only a distance of 120 miles. The colonel, with help from Cory and Pye, had led the first wagon train from Monroe to Marshall and returned with wagons full of supplies that were then taken to Vicksburg on the railroad. While bound for Monroe the first time on horseback, before the trains had started running, the three men had rescued Rachel from involuntary servitude at a tavern owned by a brutal man named Grat. Rachel had been close-mouthed about her past and how she had come to be a virtual prisoner of the tavern owner. But evidently she was the well-bred daughter of a wealthy planter, Rutherford Hanna, who had owned a plantation called Cottonwood Point near Baton Rouge. That information had come out when she took a room at a boarding house in Monroe owned by an acquaintance of the Hanna family. Lucille had come to Monroe on the railroad with her Aunt Mildred, the colonel's wife, for a visit before the first wagon train left for Texas. Cory had met and fallen in love with Lucille the previous winter when he was taken under the wing of her late father, Captain Ezekiel Farrell, owner and operator of the steamboat Missouri Zephyr. The Zephyr had been destroyed during the battle in which the Yankees had taken Fort Henry, and Captain Farrell had fallen at the Battle of Fort Donelson, dying in Cory's arms. Cory had promised the captain that he would find Lucille and take care of her, and that vow had led him to a conquered Nashville, where she had gone to stay with her aunt and uncle. Lucille had vanished, though, along with the colonel and Mrs. Thompson, and Cory's search for them had taken him to the Battle of Shiloh, and, ultimately, to Vicksburg, where he had been reunited finally with Lucille. Being drawn into the Colonel's plan for the wagon train had postponed Cory's plans to marry Lucille, so he'd been glad to see her when she made her visit to Monroe. He hadn't been prepared, though, for her insistence that she and Rachel accompany them on the journey to Texas. Until this trip, there hadn't been any trouble, but the wagons had never carried anything quite as valuable as those British rifles and pistols until now, either. As Cory held Lucille and tried to calm her, he wondered if Jason Gill had had anything to do with the attack on the wagon train. Gill was an ardent abolitionist and Yankee agent provocateur who had crossed paths with Cory several times in the past. Gill had made a specialty of stirring up trouble for the Confederacy, and Cory had spotted him in Monroe several months earlier. The abolitionist had disappeared, but Cory thought he might still be in the area, on the lookout for anything he could do to hurt the Southern cause, such as looting the wagon train of its vital cargo. Gill could have recruited those renegades and deserters for the raid. Or the men could have simply been thieves, Cory told himself. Jason Gill didn't have to be responsible for everything bad that happened in the world. But a lot certainly had happened, both good and bad, since Cory had first laid eyes on Gill in New Madrid, Missouri, the previous winter. Lucille had stopped shuddering and crying, and as Cory held her, he felt her deep, regular breathing. She had slipped back into sleep. He hoped her slumber wouldn't be disturbed by nightmares this time. Moving slowly and carefully, he lowered her to the pallet where she slept. She stirred a little but didn't awaken, and he was thankful for that. He stood up, muscles unkinking from the strained position in which he had been sitting. The arm that had been around Lucille was numb, too. He massaged feeling back into it as he quietly climbed out of the wagon and dropped to the ground beside the vehicle. Colonel Thompson, Pye, Rachel, and Alan Carter were standing several yards away, talking in low voices. Rachel turned and asked, "How is she?" "Asleep again," he said. "She dreamed that the man she killed came back for her." Rachel shivered. "Poor thing." "Lucille is a strong young woman," said Thompson. "She'll get over this." Pye scratched his beard and said, "Shoot, if I was Miss Lucille, I wouldn't worry none about ventilating that that fella. If she hadn't stopped him, he'd have likely stuck that knife in poor old Cory here." Cory nodded. "Yes, but she probably never hurt anybody else in her life until she was forced to kill that man. That's something that takes some getting used to." Even after Shiloh, killing still bothered Cory. Not as much as it once had. He could do whatever was necessary to protect himself and those he loved. But he hoped he never got to the point where he didn't blink at the idea of dealing out death. The Colonel slipped his watch from the pocket of his trousers and flipped it open. "Almost 2 o'clock, he said. "Alan, your watch is nearly over. Go on to sleep. I'll take the guard duty." "You sure, Colonel?" asked Carter. "Of course." Carter nodded his thanks and limped toward the wagon, under which his son Fred was sleeping. Fred was Cory's age, in his early 20s, but his mind was more like that of a 6-year-old. Despite that, he could handle a team of mules and drive a wagon quite well, and his friendly smile made everyone else on the wagon train glad to have him around. Pye stretched, then offered, "Reckon I better get some shut-eye, too. But let me walk you back to your wagon first, Miss Rachel." "That won't be necessary, Pye," she told him with a smile. "It's only a few feet from here." "Yeah, well, you never know when something might happen." Still smiling, Rachel shook her head and held out her hand toward the big man. Pye took it, closing his sausage-like fingers tenderly around her slender ones, and they walked toward the wagon, where Lucille